April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above Compiègne, France. Through the crystal-clear canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190A5, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermeken watched the ungainly silhouettes climbing laboriously toward his formation. The oxygen mask couldn't hide the veteran ace's expression as 16 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group lumbered upward in tight formation. Their 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engines straining against 7 tons of American engineering. Hermchen keyed his radio transmitter. The words came easily, weighted with the confidence of a man who had survived Poland, France, and 2 years over Britain. "They've sent us flying milk bottles." Static crackled back. Laughter from his wingman. More chuckles rippling through Jagdgeschwader 26 as the German formation circled above like wolves studying prey too slow to run, too clumsy to fight. Below them, the Americans climbed. Barrel-shaped fuselages topped with greenhouse canopies. Wings that seemed inadequate for bodies so massive. Propellers that dwarfed anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. To German pilots accustomed to the sleek lines of Spitfires and the desperate agility of Soviet fighters, these corpulent machines appeared almost comical. Physics itself seemed to mock them with every labored foot of altitude gained. What Hermchen didn't know, what none of the German pilots circling in the thin air could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the weapon that would systematically destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Within 18 months, these objects of derision would transform into instruments of terror. Those broad wings already held the mathematics of destruction. 3,400 rounds of ammunition, 8 synchronized Browning machine guns capable of 6,000 rounds per minute combined, enough concentrated firepower to saw a Messerschmitt in half in less than 2 seconds. Major Donald Blakesley, commanding the 335th Fighter Squadron, spotted the German formation positioning for attack. The former Eagle Squadron veteran had transferred from RAF Spitfires just weeks earlier. His hands rested on controls that felt wrong compared to the nimble British fighter he'd flown over Malta and across the Channel. The Thunderbolt stick demanded muscle where the Spitfire had required only thought. Yet something in Blakesley's gut understood what his green pilots didn't yet grasp. Survival in this machine required abandoning everything conventional wisdom taught about air combat. Among the 56 American pilots spread across French sky that morning, flew men who would become legends, future aces whose names would eventually strike fear into Luftwaffe hearts. But on April 8, 1943, they were novices in an untested machine, facing the most experienced fighter force in the world. The Germans had been fighting continuously since 1939. Veterans of Warsaw, the Blitzkrieg across France, the desperate summer over Britain, the grinding meat grinder of the Russian front. The Americans had been in combat for exactly 0 days. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, flying tail-end position in the 61st Fighter Squadron, felt sweat gathering inside his leather helmet despite the -40-degree temperature at altitude. The Oklahoma farm boy had 400 hours in his logbook, 75 in the P-47. He'd fired at towed targets, practiced formation flying, studied grainy photographs of German fighters. But the gray shapes wheeling above bore no resemblance to target sleeves or still images. They moved with predatory intent, adjusting positions with an economy of motion that spoke of practiced violence. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had emerged from June 1940 panic. As German fighters swept across France and panzer divisions carved through supposedly impregnable defenses, Alexander Kartveli received urgent specifications from the U.S. Army Air Corps. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching the Luftwaffe's best. The Georgian-born chief designer of Republic Aviation studied the requirements and understood immediately that conventional approaches would fail. In his office overlooking the Farmingdale, Long Island factory floor, Kartveli spread blueprints across drafting tables and admitted the uncomfortable truth to his design team. It will be a dinosaur, but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions. The XP-47B prototype that first flew on May 6, 1941 shocked everyone who witnessed it. At 9,900 pounds empty, it weighed 65% more than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. The massive turbo supercharger system, with its complex ducting running through the rear fuselage, created an almost pregnant appearance that would later inspire German ridicule. Test pilots approaching the aircraft for the first time invariably pause, studying the enormous machine before asking variations of the same question. This thing actually flies. Not only did it fly, it flew like nothing else at altitude. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine represented 18 cylinders of American industrial might, producing 2,000 horsepower. At 27,000 feet, where German fighters gasped for oxygen and performance degraded precipitously, the P-47's turbo supercharger, fed by exhaust gases, delivered sea-level performance in the stratosphere. The air, too thin for conventional superchargers, became the Thunderbolt's natural hunting ground. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group during training at Bridgeport, Connecticut, had developed a visceral hatred for the aircraft by January 1943. His unit had lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents between September and the new year. The P-47 killed more Americans in training than Germans would manage in the first months of actual combat. It ground-looped on landing, catching inexperienced pilots off guard with torque that yanked the aircraft sideways. It torque-rolled on takeoff if pilots failed to compensate for the massive propeller's rotational force. Worst of all, it dove with such enthusiasm that pilots discovered compressibility, shock waves forming on the wings as airspeed approached the speed of sound, controls freezing solid, aircraft accelerating toward Earth with no way to pull out except wait for denser air at lower altitudes to restore control authority. Zemke's diary from December 1942 contained entries that would never appear in official reports. Lost another boy today. Simmons, 22 years old, from Michigan. Good pilot, followed procedures exactly. The aircraft simply killed him on landing. I despise this machine. It's murdering my men before they ever face the enemy. Yet those who mastered the Thunderbolt's quirks discovered something extraordinary lurking beneath the ungainly exterior. Johnson's first flight had occurred on a clear morning in November 1942. The Oklahoma farm boy, who'd learned to fly in civilian trainers, approached the massive fighter with appropriate trepidation. Strapping into the roomy cockpit felt like climbing into a bomber's fuselage. The greenhouse canopy provided visibility unmatched by any fighter Johnson had seen, but the sheer mass of machinery surrounding him seemed antithetical to the concept of aerial combat. Throttle forward. The R-2800 responded with a bellow that vibrated through the airframe. Acceleration pressed him into the armor plate behind the seat. Tail came up. More right rudder to compensate for torque. The nose blocked all forward visibility until rotation speed arrived and Johnson hauled back on the stick, muscle required where finesse had sufficed in trainers. Airborne. Gear retracting. The P-47 climbed with what seemed like reluctant determination, as if grudgingly accepting its role as a fighter, rather than the medium bomber its size suggested. But at 10,000 feet, something changed. The engine note smoothed. Climb rate improved. At 20,000 feet, where Johnson expected performance to degrade, as it did in every aircraft he'd flown, the turbo supercharger engaged fully, and the Thunderbolt accelerated upward like gravity had weakened its grip. Johnson's post-flight report contained a single sentence that captured the experience. Like strapping yourself to a locomotive that someone convinced to leave the tracks and fly. The first combat encounters in April and May 1943 confirmed every German prejudice the P-47's appearance had generated. The Thunderbolts couldn't turn with Focke-Wulf 190s, couldn't climb with Messerschmitt 109s, couldn't match the nimble handling of experienced German pilots who'd learned their trade in 4 years of continuous combat. Luftwaffe pilots quickly developed tactics to exploit these weaknesses. Attack from below, where the heavy Thunderbolts struggled. Force-turning fights where agility mattered more than firepower. Disengage vertically, climbing away from aircraft too ponderous to follow. Hauptmann Josef Pips Priller, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 26, filed his after-action report following the first significant engagement on April 15, 1943. His assessment would be circulated through Luftwaffe headquarters as confirmation of German technical superiority. The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. Our boys are calling them Indianer, fat targets pretending to be warriors. I predict this aircraft will be remembered as a costly mistake by American designers who fundamentally misunderstand the requirements of modern air combat. Statistics seem to confirm German confidence. In their first month of operations, American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts for only 3 confirmed German kills. The Royal Air Force, observing from their Spitfire squadrons operating from adjacent airfields, quietly suggested the Americans might reconsider their choice of mount. British pilots, who'd fought the Luftwaffe since 1940 and survived through hard-won tactical evolution, developed jokes that spread through mess halls. The best evasive maneuver in a P-47? Unstrap and run around the roomy cockpit until the German pilot ran out of ammunition. But something strange was happening in those early encounters that German intelligence failed to catalog properly. The P-47s that were shot down had absorbed incredible punishment before falling. One aircraft returned from a May 4th mission with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes. Damage that would have disintegrated a Messerschmitt or Spitfire. The massive radial engine, lacking vulnerable coolant systems that liquid-cooled fighters depended on, shrugged off hits that would have stopped a German fighter cold. Coolant leak in a Daimler-Benz or Junkers engine meant immediate forced landing before the motor seized. Bullets through the P-47's air-cooled cylinders meant decreased performance, but continued operation. More significantly, when P-47s did get their guns on target, the results proved catastrophic. The Thunderbolt's weapons battery created a convergence zone of destruction that German pilots had never experienced. Unlike the rifle-caliber weapons of early war fighters or cannons with severely limited ammunition, the American fighter could maintain sustained fire for over 30 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat. Each of the 8 Browning M2 machine guns carried 425 rounds. At 1,200 rounds per minute per gun, the combined rate of fire exceeded 6,000 rounds per minute when all 8 fired in synchronized harmony. The event that would begin changing German perceptions occurred on June 26, 1943, over Le Havre, France. It involved Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron and an encounter that would become legendary on both sides of the conflict. Johnson's formation of 48 P-47s was returning from escort duty, bomber boxes safely delivered to their targets, and now limping home with battle damage and crew losses. Fuel gauges indicated sufficient reserves for the Channel crossing. The formation maintained altitude discipline, stacked from 25 to 30,000 feet, a vertical defense against the bounce attacks that had proven devastatingly effective in earlier missions. 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from the 2nd Staffel of Jagdgeschwader 26 had been vectored to intercept by ground control. Led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, younger brother of the famous Adolf Galland, the German formation executed a perfect attack profile. Diving from the sun with overwhelming speed advantage, the FW-190s tore into the rear of the American formation like sharks hitting a school of fish. Johnson, flying tail-end Charlie, the most vulnerable position in any formation, became the primary target of multiple attackers in the first seconds of combat. His world exploded in noise and violence. 2 20mm cannon shells detonated across his aircraft. The canopy shattered, transforming from protective transparency to expanding cloud of glass fragments. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into the cockpit, coating Johnson's goggles and face shield with slick liquid that smelled of synthetic oil and fear. The engine cowling tore away, flapping in the airstream before departing entirely. Fire erupted behind the instrument panel, orange flames licking upward past the gun sight. Johnson, wounded in the nose and left leg by shrapnel and bullet fragments, felt blood running hot down his flight suit. The wound burned, then went numb as adrenaline flooded his system. Training took over. Aircraft on fire at altitude. Standard procedure, bail out immediately. He reached for the canopy jettison handle and pulled. Nothing happened. He pulled again, harder. The canopy remained locked in position. A 20mm shell had exploded in the canopy track, welding the mechanism shut with twisted metal. Johnson was trapped in a dying aircraft at 27,000 feet, flames spreading, hydraulic fluid continuing to spray, instruments showing impossible readings as electrical systems failed. What happened next defied every assumption about combat damage tolerance that had been established through 4 years of aerial warfare. Despite having no forward visibility through the oil-covered windscreen, despite a barely functioning engine that shook the entire airframe with violent vibrations, suggesting catastrophic internal damage, despite controls that responded only intermittently as severed cables and damaged hydraulic lines struggled to transmit input from stick and rudder pedals, Johnson managed to level the aircraft and point it roughly toward England. The P-47 continued flying with damage that should have reduced it to falling debris. Johnson's world had contracted to immediate survival. The fire behind the instrument panel burned itself out, consuming available fuel and leaving scorched metal. The violent shaking from the engine moderated slightly, settling into a rhythm that suggested cylinders were firing out of sequence, but at least still firing. Through gaps in the oil covering his windscreen, Johnson caught glimpses of blue sky and white clouds. He flew by reference to the artificial horizon, trusting the instrument even as electrical indicators flickered and died around it. Then it got worse. A lone Focke-Wulf 190 discovered the crippled Thunderbolt limping toward the channel at less than 170 miles per hour. Historical research has never definitively identified this pilot. German combat reports from that day list several claims that might correspond to this encounter, but the peculiar nature of what followed left no clear record. Several names have been proposed: Oberfeldwebel Glunz, Lieutenant Hoffmann, Unteroffizier Meyer. The truth remains lost in the fog of combat documentation and the chaos of a dying Air Force that would, within 2 years, cease to exist. The German pilot positioned himself carefully behind Johnson's P-47. Standard fighter tactics dictated attack from astern, allowing full deflection of all weapons along the target's axis of flight. The FW-190 carried formidable armament: 4 20mm MG-151 cannons and 2 13mm MG-131 machine guns. Against an undamaged fighter, this represented overwhelming firepower. Against a crippled aircraft barely maintaining flight, it should have been instant annihilation. The German opened fire. 4 cannons and 2 heavy machine guns converged on Johnson's Thunderbolt. Tracers walked up the fuselage. Explosive shells detonated along the wings, the tail, the engine cowling. Johnson, unable to evade, could only huddle behind his armor plate and pray to a God he'd grown up believing in on an Oklahoma farm where life and death seemed simpler, more comprehensible. The Thunderbolt absorbed the entire cannon ammunition load: 120 rounds of 20mm explosive projectiles, shells designed to destroy fighters with single hits, each one carrying enough explosive to disintegrate aluminum structure, sever control cables, ignite fuel tanks. The P-47 shuddered with each impact. Metal screamed, but it continued flying. The German pilot repositioned. Professional fighter pilots learned to attack from multiple angles, ensuring complete destruction. He lined up for a second pass and opened fire again. This time only the machine guns spoke. The cannons were empty, ammunition exhausted. The 13mm rounds walked across Johnson's aircraft again, punching through already damaged metal, severing cables that had somehow remained intact during the first pass. Still, the Thunderbolt flew. The German pilot pulled alongside, likely attempting to verify the kill before returning to base. Johnson could see his face clearly through the shattered canopy. Young, blonde, expression shifting from confidence through confusion towards something approaching fear. The German pilot was staring at an aircraft that should not exist, an aircraft that had absorbed more combat damage than any fighter in the history of aerial warfare, and continued to fly straight and level toward England. The German pilot repositioned for a third attack, determination overriding disbelief. He emptied his remaining machine gun ammunition into the Thunderbolt, every round he possessed. The FW-190's guns fell silent, breeches locked back on empty chambers. Johnson's P-47 continued flying. The German pilot pulled alongside again. This time he simply stared. His expression had completed its journey from confidence to terror. He was witnessing something that invalidated everything he'd been taught about aerial combat. Something that suggested the rules had changed in ways German tacticians hadn't anticipated. After several seconds that felt eternal to both pilots, the German gave an informal salute. hand rising from stick to forehead in the traditional gesture of warrior respect, and peeled away, presumably low on fuel, indefinitely out of ammunition. Johnson flew on. The channel appeared beneath him, gray water that promised death if he ditched, but life if he could reach the English coast. The P-47's engine continued its irregular rhythm, shaking the airframe, consuming oil at rates that should have seized the motor minutes ago. But the R-2800 Double Wasp, designed with redundancy and over-engineering that seemed wasteful in peacetime, kept firing enough cylinders to turn the propeller. The white cliffs of Dover appeared through breaks in the oil coating his windscreen. Johnson descended, fighting controls that had degraded from unresponsive to nearly non-functional. He spotted Manston Airfield, the emergency landing strip on Britain's southeastern coast where damaged bombers often made desperate landings. The tower, seeing his approach, fired red flares, indicating he should not attempt landing. The aircraft too damaged. Bailout recommended. Johnson had no choice. The canopy wouldn't open. Bailout remained impossible. He lined up for final approach by instinct more than instrument reference. Throttle back. The engine responded sluggishly. Airspeed decaying. Stick back. The nose rose fractionally. The P-47 hit the runway hard, bounced, settled again. Brakes barely functional. The aircraft rolled the full length of the runway before finally stopping. Engine seizing with a final tortured grinding noise as metal components welded themselves together from heat and friction and the absence of adequate lubrication. Johnson sat in the cockpit, hands still gripping the stick, unable to process that he'd survived. Ground crews arrived with fire equipment, expecting the worst. They pried open the jammed canopy and helped extract the blood-soaked pilot from his seat. The crew chief began counting bullet holes in the aircraft. He stopped at 200. The task was pointless. The P-47 had been hit so many times, from so many angles, that distinguishing individual impacts became impossible. Large sections of the airframe showed more holes than solid metal. Engineers from Republic Aviation arrived within 48 hours, summoned urgently to examine the wreckage. They spent 3 days documenting the damage, taking photographs, making measurements, trying to understand how their design had survived punishment that exceeded every worst-case scenario they'd calculated. One cannon shell had exploded inches from Johnson's head, the armor glass windscreen stopping shrapnel that should have killed him instantly. Another shell had detonated directly against the armor plate behind his seat. The force of the explosion transferred through the steel into Johnson's spine, but the metal holding, preventing penetration. The engine had taken direct hits from cannon shells. Multiple cylinders were destroyed. The control cables were partially severed, some hanging by single strands of braided wire. 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural backbone running the length of the fuselage, were shot through completely. Yet the aircraft had brought him home across 100 miles of hostile territory and open ocean. The survival of Johnson's aircraft sent shockwaves through both air forces. American engineers studying the wreckage realized they had underestimated their own creation. The P-47's ruggedness wasn't accidental. It was the product of design philosophy that prioritized survivability over weight optimization, that accepted performance penalties in exchange for structural redundancy, that embedded armor and self-sealing fuel tanks and redundant control systems as fundamental requirements rather than afterthoughts. German intelligence, receiving combat reports from the second Staffel of Jagdgeschwader 26, initially refused to believe them. No aircraft could absorb that level of punishment, but testimony from multiple pilots who'd participated in the attack confirmed the impossible. The Thunderbolt had taken everything the Luftwaffe's best fighter could deliver and survived. Hauptmann Wilhelm Gallen's debriefing was filed with a notation that higher command should review urgently. His account described an aircraft that violated fundamental assumptions about what constituted lethal combat damage. By July 1943, American pilots were beginning to learn how to exploit the P-47's true strengths. Hub Zemke, the 56th Fighter Group commander who'd lost so many pilots to training accidents and despised the aircraft that killed them, had discovered the secret through brutal trial and error. His tactical revelation would transform the Thunderbolt from victim to predator. The breakthrough came during a debriefing after a mission where his group had lost 2 aircraft to German fighters that had exploited the P-47's poor turn performance. Zemke stood at the briefing room chalkboard, exhausted, frustrated, but beginning to understand. We've been trying to fight their fight. Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them at low altitude. Stop pretending this is a Spitfire. Use your weight, use your power, use your guns. The P-47's massive weight, initially perceived as fatal flaw, became weapon. In a dive from altitude, nothing could catch it. From 30,000 feet, a Thunderbolt could reach 550 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter could achieve even in vertical dive. Physics favored mass accelerated by gravity. The P-47 had both in abundance. This speed could be converted to altitude in a zoom climb that left pursuing German fighters helplessly behind, engines straining in thin air while the American fighter climbed away on energy management rather than raw power. Captain Walker Bard Mahurin, who would become one of the first American aces in Europe, developed the tactical application that pilots began calling the Thunderbolt turkey shoot, though official doctrine would label it boom and zoom. Instead of engaging in traditional turning dogfights where German experience and aircraft maneuverability provided decisive advantages, P-47 formations would climb to 30,000 feet, higher than German fighters could effectively operate due to supercharger limitations. When Luftwaffe formations appeared below, positioning to attack bomber streams, the Thunderbolts would roll inverted and dive, reaching speeds that made deflection shooting impossible for defending Germans, who suddenly found themselves targets rather than hunters. At the bottom of these dives, traveling at speeds that made accurate gunnery difficult, but sheer volume of fire overwhelming, the American heavy machine guns would speak. German pilots who survived these attacks described the experience in terms that suggested trauma more than tactical assessment. Facing a wall of lead, an impenetrable zone of destruction, aircraft caught in the convergence pattern didn't merely fall, they disintegrated midair, transformed from fighting machines to clouds of debris in the span of heartbeats. The true revelation of American firepower came during the August 17, 1943 dual raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the deepest penetration into Germany attempted to that date. This mission would demonstrate both the P-47's critical limitation, range even with drop tanks remained insufficient for deep escort, and its terrifying effectiveness when employed properly against targets foolish enough to present themselves. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron, had been scanning his assigned patrol zone at 28,000 feet when he spotted them. A formation of Messerschmitt 110 Zerstörer aircraft positioning to attack a box of B-17s with their heavy cannon and rocket armament. The twin-engine German fighters represented the Luftwaffe's specialized bomber killers, heavily armed but less maneuverable than single-engine types. Their tactics involved approaching bomber formations from beyond defensive gun range, launching devastating barrages from their 30mm cannons and 21cm rockets, then disengaging before escort fighters could respond. Schilling's flight of 4 Thunderbolts rolled into their attack dive from 28,000 feet. Gravity and the P-47's mass combined to produce acceleration that exceeded anything human pilots had experienced before the war. Airspeed indicators wound rapidly past redline markings, needles trembling at speeds that approached compressibility. The earth below rushed upward with terrifying velocity. Unteroffizier Heinrich Roth, a gunner in one of the Me-110s, survived the attack. His POW interrogation 3 days later would be transcribed and filed in intelligence reports that eventually reached American fighter group commanders. The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven. I opened fire at 800 meters. Good hits. I saw them strike the lead fighter's wing. The P-47 didn't even wobble. Then he fired. Roth's voice, according to the interrogator's notes, had become unsteady at this point in the debriefing. The aircraft ahead of us simply came apart. Not shot down, destroyed. Wings separated from fuselage and a tail severed, the crew compartment shredded into metal confetti. In 2 seconds, a Zerstörer became nothing. I saw pieces, large pieces, falling separately. The pilot, his seat, the gunner, all separate, all falling. 8 Messerschmitt 110s were destroyed in less than 1 minute. The remaining German pilots broke formation and dove away, abandoning their attack run, bomber-killing mission forgotten in the desperate need to escape the Thunderbolts that had appeared from above like divine judgment. Some of these experienced Luftwaffe pilots had survived hundreds of combat missions on both Eastern and Western fronts. They'd faced Spitfires over Britain, Hurricanes over France, Yaks and Lags over Russia. None of those encounters had prepared them for concentrated firepower of 8 synchronized American heavy machine guns. Each P-47 carried 425 rounds per gun, 3,400 rounds total, weighing nearly 900 pounds when loaded. At convergence distance, typically set at 300 yards by armorers adjusting each gun's mounting angle, all 8 guns' ballistic paths intersected in a zone roughly 6 feet in diameter. Anything in that zone faced 100 half-inch projectiles per second, each traveling at 2,900 feet per second, each carrying enough kinetic energy to punch through armor plate or structural members or human flesh with equal efficiency. The ammunition itself represented a revelation of American industrial capacity that German logistics officers struggled to comprehend. While Luftwaffe fighters struggled with limited cannon ammunition, typically 120 to 200 rounds for a 20-millimeter weapon, enough for perhaps 3 sustained bursts before breaches locked back empty, American pilots could maintain fire for over half a minute. The standard combat load mixed armor-piercing incendiary tracer, and standard ball ammunition in patterns designed to both destroy and ignite, to provide visual feedback through tracers while delivering maximum destructive effect. Lieutenant Colonel Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, who would become the top American ace in Europe with 28 victories, described the effect in a letter home that censors cleared because it contained no tactical information that might aid the enemy. When you hit them with all 8, they don't just go down, they explode. I saw a 109 literally cut in half, the tail falling one way, the nose and wings another. The pilot never knew what hit him. One moment he's an experienced German fighter pilot, veteran of who knows how many missions. Next moment he's gone. Not dead, gone. Ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe was discovering another horrifying reality about the P-47. Its performance improved dramatically with altitude, while German fighters suffered progressive degradation. The turbo-supercharged double Wasp engine maintained its rated power output up to 30,000 feet. German fighters, relying on single-stage or two-stage mechanical superchargers, saw their performance degrade significantly above 25,000 feet. The BMW and Daimler-Benz engines that powered Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts, powerful at medium altitudes where most combat had occurred during previous years, were gasping for oxygen at the altitudes where American bomber formations now operated. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp encountered this reality fatally on October 8, 1943. Leading Jagdgeschwader 1 against a B-17 formation at 28,000 feet over Bremen, Philipp found his Focke-Wulf 190A6 sluggish and unresponsive in the thin air. One of Germany's most successful aces, with 206 victories, a man who had survived over 500 combat missions on both Eastern and Western fronts, Philipp was about to discover that experience and skill meant nothing when aircraft performance failed. The BMW 801 engine, powerful at medium altitudes, was gasping for oxygen nearly 6 miles above the Earth. When P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group dove on his formation from 32,000 feet, an altitude German fighters could barely reach, let alone fight effectively at, Philipp's unit became sitting ducks. Robert Johnson, now an experienced combat pilot well on his way to ace status with 11 confirmed victories, was flying at 31,000 feet when he spotted Philipp's distinctive Focke-Wulf with its elaborate nose art. The dive took seconds. Airspeed building rapidly past 500 miles per hour, Philipp's aircraft grew larger in the gun sight. At 300 yards, Johnson pressed the trigger. His combat report, filed that evening, was clinical in its brevity. Opened fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection. Observed strikes along entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. No parachute observed. Hans Philipp, who had survived Warsaw in France and Britain and Russia, who had been awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, who had trained dozens of pilots and written tactical manuals, ceased to exist in approximately 2 seconds. 8 Browning machine guns firing at combined rate of 6,000 rounds per minute had converted one of Germany's best into scattered debris falling toward Bremen. Philipp's death sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe that resonated far beyond the loss of a single pilot, however accomplished. If one of their best couldn't survive against the Thunderbolts, what chance did average pilots have? The uncomfortable question began circulating through ready rooms and officers' messes. No one voiced it officially, but everyone understood the implication. German High Command ordered immediate investigation into the P-47's capabilities. The report delivered to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring in November 1943 contained assessments that prompted the commander of the Luftwaffe to reportedly throw the document across his office. The Thunderbolt's service ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet, higher than any German fighter could reach. Its dive speed approached the sound barrier, physics rather than engineering becoming the limiting factor. Its armor included 3/8-inch steel plate behind the pilot, half-inch bulletproof glass windscreen, and armored deflection plates around the engine. Most disturbingly, its rugged construction allowed it to absorb damage that would destroy 3 conventional fighters and still return home. The war was changing. The sky was changing. And the laughter that had greeted the P-47's arrival in April had died with the pilots who'd mocked those fat American fighters. In its place, a growing fear that no amount of experience or skill or courage could overcome. The mathematics of industrial war were speaking, and they spoke in the thunder of 8 synchronized machine guns. January 1944. The P-47D-22 that taxied onto the hard stand at Boxted Airfield in Essex looked identical to earlier variants until the engine started. Then everything changed. The Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller featured paddle blades, 13 feet in diameter with broad chord profiles that bit into the air like massive oars. The sound was different, deeper, more aggressive, a thundering roar that could be heard from miles away as blade tips exceeded supersonic speeds in their rotational arc. Hub Zemke stood on the flight line watching the first of these new variants arrive, manifest listing it simply as D-22-22. His 56th Fighter Group had been flying Thunderbolts for 14 months now. The initial hatred had evolved into grudging respect, then into something approaching affection for an aircraft that had kept his pilots alive through impossible situations. But this new variant represented a fundamental transformation that German intelligence would take weeks to fully appreciate. The test pilot who'd ferried the aircraft from the depot climbed down from the cockpit, flight suit dark with sweat despite January cold. "Sir, she climbs like the devil himself is chasing her, 3,000 feet per minute at sea level. At altitude, she'll stay with anything the Germans have." Zemke's response was immediate. "Get every pilot through transition training immediately. I want this variant operational within 2 weeks." The improvement in climb rate was immediate and dramatic. Where earlier Thunderbolts had climbed at an anemic 2,200 feet per minute at sea level, adequate for high-altitude interception, but disastrous in turning dogfights where altitude equals energy equals life, the paddle blade variants could achieve 3,000 feet per minute, matching or exceeding German fighters at most altitudes. The massive propeller also improved acceleration in level flight, allowing P-47s to build energy faster when maneuvering. Energy management, that abstract concept that separated dead pilots from aces, had suddenly shifted in favor of the Americans. The first German pilot to encounter the new variants was Hauptmann Heinz Knoke of Jagdgeschwader 11, a veteran with over 200 combat missions who'd survived the brutal fighting over Germany through skill and situational awareness that bordered on prescient. February 1944 found him leading a scramble near Hanover, vectored by ground control to intercept bombers at 25,000 feet. They spotted the P-47 formation first, fat silhouettes against winter sky, escort screen positioned above the bomber boxes. Standard tactic: bounce them from above and behind, use the altitude advantage to dictate engagement terms, hit fast and disengage before the heavy American fighters could respond effectively. Knoke's swarm rolled into attack. The Americans didn't run. They didn't dive away. They turned directly into the German formation and climbed aggressively, with performance that made Knoke's combat experienced mind reject what his eyes reported. P-47s didn't climb like that. Couldn't climb like that. Yet they were matching his rate, negating the altitude advantage that had kept him alive through 2 years of defensive fighting over the Reich. Schmidt, flying his wing, called break but broke too late. The Americans had converted their climb into a high yo-yo maneuver, trading speed for altitude, then rolling inverted at the apex, and diving back down with all the terrifying velocity that mass and gravity provided. Schmidt's Focke-Wulf came apart under concentrated fire, not falling so much as disintegrating, large pieces spinning away separately, while smaller fragments created a debris cloud that marked where an aircraft and pilot had existed seconds earlier. Noakes survived through instinct, shoving stick forward and diving away, accepting the humiliation of retreat because pride was luxury that dead men couldn't afford. That evening, his combat diary entry would be discovered after the war in archives that documented the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe. The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We bounced a formation near Hanover expecting our usual advantage. They turned into us and climbed with us. When we tried to disengage, they followed us up to 30,000 feet. Schmidt was caught and blown apart. Nothing left but smoke and fragments. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year. The paddle blade propeller did more than improve performance. It changed the acoustic signature of the Thunderbolt in ways that would prove psychologically devastating. The distinctive thundering roar created by blade tips reaching supersonic speeds could be heard from miles away, announcing the Americans' approach long before visual acquisition became possible. German ground troops reported being able to identify approaching P-47s by sound alone. A deep, threatening rumble that meant death from above was hunting, searching, preparing to deliver judgment upon anything that moved in daylight. They began calling it Donnerschlag, thunderclap, and the name spread through Wehrmacht units with the speed that truly effective fear travels. Not the sharp crack of lightning, but the rolling, sustained thunder that follows, impossible to pinpoint, impossible to hide from, a sound that vibrated through chest cavities and reminded everyone hearing it that the Americans owned the sky completely. Josef Priller, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 26, had stopped filing the confident assessments that had characterized his early reports. March 1944 found him flying defensive missions constantly, no longer the aggressive hunter, but the desperate defender trying to preserve what remained of his unit's strength. In 1 week, he lost 7 pilots, 7 men he'd trained, flown with, drunk with in officers' messes that seemed increasingly empty as familiar faces disappeared. The letter he wrote to a friend, intercepted and captured when Allied forces overran the postal facility, contained no trace of the arrogance that had characterized his April 1943 assessment of American capabilities. We used to hunt them. Now they hunt us. At 30,000 feet, they own the sky completely. Their guns never stop firing, not short bursts like ours, but sustained streams that go on forever. When you hear that sound, that terrible hammering, you know someone is about to die. Usually it's us. But Priller maintained public bravado for propaganda purposes. When German radio interviewed him for a morale broadcast, his statement emphasized German courage and fighting spirit, carefully avoiding any mention of the growing dread that accompanied every mission briefing. By March 1944, P-47s equipped with external fuel tanks could escort bombers deep into Germany. The standard configuration carried 2 108-gallon wing tanks or a 75-gallon belly tank, extending range to over 1,000 miles. With a paddle blade propeller providing improved performance even when loaded, Thunderbolts could fight on equal terms immediately after dropping tanks. No longer did German pilots enjoy a window of vulnerability where heavily laden Americans struggled with degraded maneuverability. The improved climb rate and acceleration meant the P-47s could engage or disengage at will, dictating combat terms in ways that inverted the previous year's dynamic. The Luftwaffe's response revealed desperation disguised as tactical evolution, concentrate on the bombers, hoping to inflict enough losses to stop the American daylight campaign. But this required flying through the P-47 escort screen, an increasingly suicidal proposition that consumed experienced pilots at rates that German training establishments couldn't replace. Major Gunther Rahl, one of Germany's top aces with 275 victories, mostly earned on the Eastern Front, had been transferred west in late 1943. The Eastern Front, for all its brutality, had offered opportunities for aggressive tactics against Soviet pilots, whose training and equipment often proved inferior. The Western Front offered only systematic slaughter. March 6, 1944, near Frankfurt. Rahl was leading a formation attempting to intercept B-17 when the Thunderbolts appeared above. What happened next he would recount in post-war interviews, voice still carrying traces of the trauma. "We saw them above us, fat silhouettes against the sun. Someone laughed. Nervous laughter, the kind you hear when fear tries to disguise itself as confidence, and said, 'Here come the flying pigs.' Nobody was laughing 30 seconds later. The Americans came down like an avalanche, faster than Rahl's formation could react. Physics and tactics had merged into devastating effectiveness. The first pass destroyed 3 fighters. Not damaged, not forced down, but destroyed. Aircraft transformed into burning debris in the time it took for Rahl's mind to process that combat had begun. Their guns didn't fire in bursts. They poured out solid streams of fire, tracers marking trajectories through sky that seemed suddenly too small to hide in. Rahl took hits. 20-millimeter cannon shells would have killed him instantly, but the Americans used only machine guns, half-inch projectiles that punched through his aircraft's cowling, severed hydraulic lines, wounded him in the left shoulder with fragments from an exploding instrument. He survived through combination of luck and the diving speed his Focke-Wulf could achieve, reaching velocities that even the Thunderbolts couldn't match in vertical descent. But the wound was serious enough to ground him for 3 months. Time spent watching the air war statistics that documented the Luftwaffe's death in spreadsheets and sortie counts. His assessment, delivered to intelligence officers who filed it in reports that would never reach Hitler's desk, contained brutal honesty. Getting caught in that stream of fire means instant death. Their weapons don't just damage, they erase. Aircraft, pilot, everything. Gone. The escort missions revealed another P-47 advantage that German logistics officers had warned about, but field commanders hadn't fully appreciated until experiencing it operationally. Endurance. While German fighters operated at maximum power settings that consumed fuel rapidly, the BMW and Daimler-Benz engines gulping avgas at rates that limited combat time to minutes rather than hours, the big American radials could cruise efficiently at high altitude. Thunderbolts could remain with the bombers for hours, rotating top cover duties, maintaining enough fuel for combat in return, while German pilots had to attack quickly and disengage before fuel exhaustion, forced landing at whatever field offered itself. German pilots increasingly found themselves pursued during retreat, slaughtered while low on fuel, and unable to maneuver effectively. The Americans, with reserves remaining, could maintain pursuit, wait for the inevitable moment when fuel starvation forced predictable flight paths, then close for kills that were less combat than execution. Gabreski had 15 victories now, climbing steadily toward the 28 that would make him the top American ace in Europe. Johnson had 19. The wounds from his June encounter healed, but memory of being trapped in a dying aircraft never far from consciousness. Mahurin had 16, his boom and zoom tactics studied and replicated across P-47 units. These men had developed as aces not despite the Thunderbolt's characteristics, but because of them, learning to exploit mass and power and firepower in ways that conventional fighter tactics never anticipated. April 1944 brought a transformation that would make the P-47 truly multi-role. As more P-51 Mustangs arrived to take over long-range escort duties, their laminar flow wings and efficient Merlin engines providing range the Thunderbolt couldn't match despite external tanks, P-47 units increasingly focused on ground attack. The transition revealed dimensions of lethality that made the aircraft's air-to-air capabilities seem almost conservative by comparison. The P-47's heavy machine gun battery proved equally effective against ground targets. Standard armor-piercing incendiary ammunition could penetrate the top armor of most German vehicles. Tanks reinforced their front glacis plates, but left roofs vulnerable to vertical attack. The sheer volume of fire could destroy soft targets in seconds. A 2-second burst put 160 half-inch projectiles into a target area the size of a truck. Mathematics and ballistics combined to make daylight movement suicidal for Wehrmacht forces. The D-25 variant could carry 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pounder under the fuselage, a bomb load equal to early war medium bombers. Later variants added zero-length rocket stubs for 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets. each equivalent to a 105mm artillery shell. The P-47 had evolved from pure fighter into something unprecedented. Flying artillery with precision that made it more effective than traditional ground-based batteries that fired dozens of shells to achieve what a single Thunderbolt accomplished in one pass. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, experienced P-47 ground attacks firsthand. His memoirs, published decades after the war, would describe encounters that still carried weight of trauma. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces behind their canopies. Young men, boys really, Americans who should have been playing baseball or attending university. Instead, they were delivering death with mechanical efficiency. The sound was terrifying in ways that artillery bombardment never achieved. Engines roaring as throttles pushed forward for attack runs. Rockets screaming as they left their rails, that distinctive shriek that meant high explosive warheads were incoming. Then the hammer of those heavy machine guns, 8 weapons firing in perfect synchronization, creating a sound like industrial machinery tearing metal apart. Von Luck watched a column of his trucks cease to exist during one attack. 20 vehicles, each carrying supplies or troops or ammunition, transformed into burning wreckage in the span of one pass. The psychological effect on his men proved as devastating as the material losses. These were veterans who'd survived the Eastern Front, men who'd endured Stalingrad and Kursk, and the grinding retreats through Ukraine. They'd faced Soviet artillery and Katyusha rocket barrages and T-34 attacks. None of those experiences had prepared them for the Yabos, fighter bombers, that made daylight movement impossible. Von Luck's assessment, recorded in his diary: they were something beyond fighter bombers. They were flying artillery with the accuracy of snipers. Against artillery, you dig in and endure. Against snipers, you take cover and wait. Against the Thunderbolts, there was no defense except not moving, not existing, becoming invisible through sheer stillness and prayer. June 6, 1944. Over 500 P-47s provided air cover for the invasion, creating an impenetrable umbrella over the beaches. The Luftwaffe discovered how completely the balance of power had shifted. German fighters attempting to reach the landing zones were massacred with efficiency that made previous air battles seem almost sporting by comparison. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of Jagdgeschwader II was one of only 3 German pilots to reach the beaches that morning. His after-action report, filed in the chaos of the Allied breakout and later captured in Wehrmacht archives, documented the sky's new ownership. The sky belonged to the Americans. Thunderbolts were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet. Layers of escorts, each covering different altitude bands, creating vertical defense that was impenetrable. Fischer's Staffel had tried to break through at dawn. 12 fighters from his group, all that could be made operational given fuel shortages and maintenance issues and the grinding attrition that had consumed the Luftwaffe over the previous year. They approached from the east, hoping to use the rising sun for concealment, executing tactics that had worked in 1940 and 1941 and even 1942. I was the only one to return, Fischer's report continued, handwriting becoming less controlled as the account progressed. The P-47s were waiting at every altitude. You couldn't climb over them. They were at 35,000 feet, higher than we could reach. Couldn't dive under them. They had aircraft orbiting at wavetop level. Their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain. Hoffman went first, then Becker, then all the others in sequence too rapid to track individually. I survived by running immediately, diving away the moment I saw the first aircraft explode, accepting cowardice because death served no purpose. Fischer landed with his Focke-Wulf shot to pieces, evidence of how close he'd come to joining his comrades. He refused to fly against P-47s again. 3 days later, he requested transfer to the Eastern Front, preferring to face Soviet fighters rather than the American machines that had destroyed his unit in minutes. Joseph Priller's D-Day mission would become famous in German aviation lore. 2 aircraft making a defiant low-level strafing run on Sword Beach, one of the only Luftwaffe attacks to reach the landing zones. The reality behind the legend was less heroic than desperate. Priller and his wingman flew 40 kilometers at wave-top height to avoid radar detection, every meter of altitude potentially fatal if Allied fighters spotted them. When they reached the beach, the sky was black with aircraft, all American, all British, not a single German fighter visible. They made one pass, fired everything their cannons and machine guns carried, and ran for their lives. Three P-47s dove on them during their escape. The only reason Priller survived was that the Americans were loaded with bombs for ground attack and didn't pursue aggressively. If they had been clean fighters, if they had chased with the same determination they showed in air-to-air combat, Priller knew he would have died over the channel. His after-action report, discovered in captured files, contained none of the defiant heroism that propaganda would later construct. This is the end. We cannot stop this invasion. We cannot even contest the sky above it. The Thunderbolts have won, not through better pilots or superior tactics, through overwhelming material superiority that makes individual skill irrelevant. The weeks following D-Day saw systematic destruction of German movement in daylight. Statistics documented the slaughter with bureaucratic precision. In June alone, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts claimed 651 locomotives destroyed, 3,847 trucks destroyed, 512 tanks and armored vehicles destroyed, 4,553 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed. But numbers on pages failed to capture the reality on the ground. A captured Wehrmacht colonel's diary, found in his belongings when Allied forces overran his headquarters, told the story more effectively. We are forced to move only at night. Daylight movement is suicide. The American fighters, they call them Thunderbolts, find everything. Yesterday, an entire supply convoy destroyed in minutes. 30 trucks, gone. The smoke columns marked where they died. The pilots say they feel hunted, like rabbits before eagles. There is no defense, no counter tactic, no way to fight back except survive until darkness and hope tomorrow brings miracles that today denied. The Germans tried everything to counter the Thunderbolt threat. They reinforced vehicle armor with additional plates welded onto roofs. The rockets penetrated anyway. Shaped charges designed to defeat thickness that Wehrmacht engineers could add given weight constraints and manufacturing limitations. They deployed more anti-aircraft guns to protect movement corridors. P-47s were too fast at low altitude, too aggressive in their attacks, pilots willing to press through flak to deliver ordnance on target. They developed new camouflage techniques, studied American search patterns, instituted elaborate concealment protocols. Nothing worked. The P-47's combination of speed, armor, and firepower made them nearly unstoppable once pilots identified targets. Even the feared 88mm flak guns, weapons that had destroyed countless bombers, struggled to track the fast-moving fighters at low altitude. Radar-directed fire control systems designed for high-altitude interception proved inadequate against aircraft approaching at 300 feet, doing 400 miles per hour. By August 1944, the psychological toll had become measurable. Luftwaffe medical officers began documenting a phenomenon they termed Jabo fever, physical symptoms of stress appearing when Thunderbolts were reported in the area. Veterans who had faced Spitfires and hurricanes over Britain without flinching, who had flown through Soviet flak over Stalingrad and survived mid-air collisions and crash landings, and every horror that aerial combat could produce, now became physically ill before missions against P-47s. The distinctive thunder of approaching Thunderbolts caused panic among ground troops who had learned that survival meant finding cover immediately. The sound traveled farther than visual acquisition range, providing warning measured in seconds rather than minutes. Those seconds determined who lived and who became statistics in after-action reports. Veteran infantry learned to distinguish the Thunderbolt's roar from other aircraft engines, react before conscious thought completed processing, dive for ditches or buildings, or tree cover with the urgency that prey animals show when predators approach. Priller's letter to his wife, written in August 1944 and discovered when Allied forces occupied his wife's home, was never meant for anyone else's eyes. My love, I must tell you what I cannot tell my men. We are losing this war in the sky. The Thunderbolts that we laughed at, that I personally mocked as pregnant cows and flying milk bottles, they haunt me now. The letter continued across 3 pages of personal stationery, handwriting deteriorating from controlled script to barely legible scrawl. I have lost 40 pilots since D-Day. 40 men I trained, men I knew, men whose families I have written to with lies about heroic deaths when the truth is they were slaughtered. When I hear that sound, that terrible hammering of 8 machine guns firing together, I know another friend is about to die. The most devastating section came near the end. They are not just machines. They are a system of industrial destruction we cannot match. For everyone we shoot down, 5 more appear the next day. We lose one pilot, and he is gone forever, irreplaceable. The Americans lose one pilot, and 2 arrive to replace him, better trained than the man who died, flying newer aircraft with more capabilities. Priller concluded with observation that captured the fundamental asymmetry. This is not war between nations. This is war between an industry and an army. The industry is winning. As summer turned to fall, reports began filtering through Luftwaffe intelligence about a new threat: jet fighters, Messerschmitt 262s with speeds exceeding 540 miles per hour, performance that should make them untouchable by propeller-driven aircraft. German propaganda spoke of wonder weapons that would turn the tide, restore air superiority, give the fatherland time to deploy other secret weapons that would force the Allies to negotiate peace. But American fighter pilots were already developing tactics to counter jets, discovering vulnerabilities that German engineers hadn't anticipated. Takeoff and landing, when jets were most vulnerable, throttles advanced or retarded, aircraft in configuration that couldn't exploit speed advantages. And high-speed dives from altitude, where the P-47's mass and gravity could produce velocities approaching those of jets in level flight. The question facing the Luftwaffe as 1944 ended was whether technological desperation could overcome material superiority, whether German jets produced in limited numbers by factories under constant bombardment could turn back the avalanche of Thunderbolts that now numbered in the thousands. The answer was emerging in the wreckage scattered across German soil, in the smoke columns that marked burning vehicles, in the faces of pilots who'd seen too many friends die to the thunder of American guns. Industrial war had its own mathematics, and those equations solved inexorably toward one conclusion: regardless of how many wonder weapons German engineering produced, the sky belonged to America. And everyone fighting beneath it knew that truth, with the certainty that comes from direct experience of overwhelming force, applied with systematic efficiency. Summer 1944 brought variants that represented the ultimate evolution of Alexander Kartvel's dinosaur. The P-47NM featured water methanol injection systems that boosted the R-2800's output to 2,800 horsepower, 400 more than standard models, enough to push speeds past 470 miles per hour in level flight at 30,000 feet. Refined aerodynamics reduced drag. Every component had been optimized through combat experience distilled into engineering modifications. These ultimate Thunderbolts were deployed specifically to counter German jets in V-1 flying bombs, threats that required performance beyond what earlier variants could deliver. Major George Bostwick, commanding the 63rd Fighter Squadron equipped with P-47Ms, understood his mission with clarity that left no room for ambiguity. German jets represented technological superiority that might, if deployed in sufficient numbers with adequate fuel and experienced pilots, contest American air dominance. His job was ensuring that possibility never materialized beyond theoretical discussion in Luftwaffe planning rooms. The P-47N variant, developed simultaneously for Pacific operations, featured increased fuel capacity through wet wings holding 93 gallons each. Range extended to 2,350 miles. The short-legged fighter of 1943 had become a true long-range weapon capable of escorting B-29s to Japan and back. American engineering had solved problems through brute force application of resources, adding fuel capacity where German designers would have obsessed over aerodynamic efficiency. November 27, 1944. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 342nd Fighter Group was patrolling at 28,000 feet when his wingman called out contacts climbing from a suspected jet base near Münster. Meyer rolled inverted to acquire visual. 2 Messerschmitt 262s, distinctive twin-engine profiles, unmistakable even at distance, climbing rapidly away from their airfield. Standard jet tactics emphasize speed advantage. Get airborne, accelerate to combat velocity, engage or disengage at will based on tactical opportunity. No propeller-driven fighter could catch them in level flight once they reached operational speeds exceeding 540 miles per hour. But Meyer understood that all advantages carried corresponding vulnerabilities. Jets couldn't loiter. Their fuel consumption made extended patrols impossible. They had to attack quickly or return to base before reserves depleted. He waited. Patience in combat separated survivors from casualties. The jets leveled off at 30,000 feet, likely searching for bomber formations to attack. Meyer pushed his throttle forward and nosed over into a dive that would have terrified pilots unfamiliar with what the Thunderbolt could achieve when gravity and mass combine. Airspeed built rapidly, 300 miles per hour, 400, 450. The P-47 shuddered as it approached compressibility, shock waves forming on control surfaces. But Meyer had dived these aircraft dozens of times and understood exactly how far he could push before aerodynamics became dangerous. At 490 miles per hour, he was traveling faster than most German fighters could achieve in vertical dives, fast enough to catch an Me-262 in level flight. The jet pilot, confident in his speed advantage, never registered the threat until tracer rounds walked past his canopy. By then, reaction time had expired. Meyer's 8 Brownings spoke for 2 seconds. The jet came apart spectacularly, both engines separating from the fuselage as concentrated fire severed mounting structures, the pilot compartment disintegrating, the aircraft transforming from technological marvel to scattered debris in the span of heartbeats. Meyer's combat report, filed that evening with clinical precision, noted, "The enemy aircraft disintegrated under fire. Large pieces, including both engines, separated from the fuselage. The pilot did not escape. The concentrated fire of 850 caliber guns proved more effective than we anticipated against jet aircraft." The pattern emerged through subsequent engagements. P-47 stationed near known jet airfields would patrol at maximum altitude, watching for the telltale contrails of jets taking off or landing. When opportunities presented themselves, dive attacks at speeds the jets couldn't match during vulnerable phases of flight. German jet pilots, accustomed to outrunning everything through raw performance, found themselves caught during the seconds when physics worked against them. Between November 1944 and March 1945, P-47s accounted for over 15 jet kills, more than many historians would later credit, since combat reports were conservative and pilots required confirmation that wasn't always available in the chaos of battle. The psychological impact exceeded the tactical significance. Germany's wonder weapons, jets that propaganda claimed would restore air superiority, couldn't escape the Thunderbolts even with 500-mile-per-hour speed advantages. A captured German jet pilot's diary, discovered in his belongings after he was shot down in February 1945, documented the fear. "The Americans have found our weakness. We are fast in level flight but helpless during takeoff. Yesterday, 2 262s were destroyed before reaching 1,000 meters altitude. The Thunderbolts dove from above. We never saw them approach." This wonder weapon feels like a death trap. I would rather fly a 190 and have time to react than sit in a jet knowing that any moment concentrated fire might arrive without warning. Bostwick shot down 2 Me-262s in March 1945, both during intercepts near known jet bases. His tactical report emphasized firepower over speed. "The jets are faster, but they can't turn and can't take punishment. One good burst from our battery, and they come apart like they're made of paper. They have to slow down to attack bombers. That's when we get them. Position yourself properly and speed advantage means nothing." January 1st, 1945 brought Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate final gamble. Nearly 900 German fighters, including their best remaining pilots, launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. Hitler had personally ordered the operation, convinced that destroying Allied air power on the ground would provide breathing room for German forces retreating across the Rhine. At Y-34 airfield near Metz, home to the 365th Fighter Group's P-47s, the attack initially achieved complete surprise. German fighters strafed hardstands methodically, destroying 22 Thunderbolts on the ground along with several other aircraft. Buildings burned, ammunition dumps exploded. Chaos consumed the flight line as ground crews scrambled for cover and station pilots sprinted toward surviving aircraft. One German pilot, shot down by anti-aircraft fire during his strafing run, was captured and brought to the command post while the attack continued around them. He pointed at the burning aircraft visible through the window, face flushed with adrenaline and the brief euphoria of successful attack. The words emerged in accented English. What do you think of that? Major George Brooking, the group's operations officer, had been coordinating defensive responses when the German pilot was brought in. He looked at the burning Thunderbolts, calculated losses rapidly, then turned to face the captured pilot. His response would become legendary throughout the Ninth Air Force, repeated in ready rooms and officers' messes as encapsulation of the fundamental asymmetry that defined this war. Brooking pointed to the flight line where ground crews were already pushing damaged aircraft aside, preparing hard stands for replacements. By tomorrow, we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots? The German pilot's smirk disappeared. His face transformed from triumph to comprehension to something approaching despair as the implications processed. Shot-down aircraft meant nothing to Americans. Factories produced them faster than combat consumed them. Shot-down pilots meant everything to Germans. Each loss represented years of training that couldn't be replaced, experience that died with the man, capabilities that vanished permanently from an air force already hemorrhaging strength. Within 48 hours, factory-fresh P-47D-40s filled the flight line, flown in from depots in England, where hundreds of Thunderbolts waited in storage for exactly this contingency. American logistics had anticipated every scenario, positioned reserves to cover every possible loss rate, built redundancy into supply chains that German planners could only fantasize about. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft in Bodenplatte, 213 pilots killed, including many irreplaceable instructors and squadron leaders who'd been pulled from training duties for this operation. Personnel losses they could never replace. German training establishments were producing pilots with less than 100 hours total flight time, sending them into combat against Americans who arrived with 400 hours, including extensive gunnery practice and tactical instruction. Americans lost 134 aircraft total across all attacked airfields, all replaced within 1 week. The industrial mathematics spoke with finality that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. Republic Aviation at peak production completed one P-47 every hour around the clock. The Farmingdale factory on Long Island had produced 15,683 Thunderbolts total, more than any other American fighter. The Evansville plant in Indiana, built from empty farmland in 1942, was producing 500 aircraft monthly by 1944. Each P-47D required 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, 300 pounds of rubber. The engine alone contained 2,400 components, machined to tolerances of 1,000th of an inch. American workers, many of them women who had never seen an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, assembled these complex machines with precision exceeding peacetime standards. Quality control inspectors rejected components for deviations measured in 10,000ths of an inch. Every rivet was inspected. Every control cable was tested. Every system was validated before aircraft left the factory floor. The result was reliability that German maintenance crews, struggling with parts shortages and improvised repairs, couldn't achieve even with vastly more experienced personnel. Ammunition production was equally staggering. Each P-47 sortie required 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. With hundreds of Thunderbolts flying daily missions, consumption exceeded 10 million rounds monthly by mid-1944. Lake City Arsenal in Missouri, one of several ammunition plants, produced 30 million rounds monthly. Each cartridge manufactured to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch, ensuring reliable feeding through synchronized gun mechanisms that jammed if ammunition dimensions varied even slightly. Fuel consumption was enormous. Each Thunderbolt burned 100 gallons per hour in normal flight, up to 300 gallons in combat with water injection engaged. The Ninth Air Force alone consumed over 25 million gallons of aviation fuel monthly by late 1944, all shipped across the Atlantic in tankers that were themselves products of American mass production. Liberty ships built in weeks rather than months, produced in quantities that exceeded German U-boat capabilities to sink them. Even more impressive than aircraft production was pilot training. By 1944, the United States graduated 30,000 pilots annually from advanced training, more than Germany had trained in the entire war. Each P-47 pilot received minimum 400 hours of flight training before entering combat, including 100 hours in advanced fighters. They'd practiced against captured German aircraft, understanding enemy capabilities and limitations before first contact. They'd studied technical manuals that German pilots never received, comprehensive documentation covering every system and emergency procedure. German pilots entering combat by 1945 averaged less than 100 hours total time. Fuel shortages meant training consisted of lectures and ground instruction rather than flight time. Ammunition shortages meant gunnery practice was theoretical rather than practical. They learned to fly but not to fight, arrived at operational units as liabilities rather than assets, and died quickly against opponents who'd been trained systematically and comprehensively. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, arriving in England in September 1944, exemplified the American training advantage. His logbook showed 420 hours, including 75 in the P-47. He'd fired at towed targets until gunnery became instinctive. He'd practiced deflection shooting against maneuvering aircraft. He'd studied gun camera film from actual combat, learning what worked and what got pilots killed. His first mission, he executed tactics with precision that suggested months of combat experience rather than first exposure to enemy aircraft. The German pilot he faced that day couldn't have had half Roberts' training. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds, a brief turning fight where Roberts maintained energy discipline and the German pilot burned speed in desperate maneuvers that only delayed the inevitable. When Roberts squeezed the trigger, 8 guns firing in perfect synchronization, the German aircraft disintegrated. There was no contest, no dramatic dogfight, no moment where outcome hung in balance. Just systematic application of superior training and superior firepower against an opponent whose courage couldn't compensate for inadequate preparation. Roberts' assessment in his diary that evening captured the asymmetry. It wasn't even a fair fight. He tried his best but never had a chance. I felt almost guilty, like shooting someone who can't shoot back properly. Then I remembered what they did at Pearl Harbor and across Europe, and the guilt disappeared. This is what happens when industrial nations fight total war. One side produces pilots and aircraft faster than the other can kill them. Eventually, mathematics wins. March 1945, German propaganda officials summoned Josef Priller for an interview seeking morale-boosting statements about German determination and fighting spirit. The Oberst who had mocked P-47s as pregnant cows in April 1943, who had filed confident assessments of American inferiority, who had embodied Luftwaffe arrogance at its peak, arrived at the interview battle-weary and honest in ways that propaganda couldn't use. The interviewer, a civilian who'd never experienced combat, opened with questions designed to elicit approved narratives. Priller's responses deviated immediately from the script. His statement, deemed too demoralizing for publication, was filed in archives that Allied forces would later capture. You want me to tell the people we are still winning? I cannot lie to them. You want me to blame leadership? Say equipment is faulty? No, I will tell you the truth even if you cannot broadcast it. His voice, according to the interviewer's notes, carried exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built. Its firepower is unprecedented. 8 weapons that never jam, never overheat, never run out of ammunition in normal combat. It carries bombs like a medium bomber, fires rockets like artillery, and fights like a fighter when needed. Priller continued despite the interviewer's attempts to redirect toward more acceptable topics. But beyond the machine is what it represents. Unlimited American production. They lose 10 aircraft and build 20. We lose one and it's gone forever. Their pilots arrive better trained than our instructors. They have fuel for training, ammunition for practice, spare parts for everything. We have nothing but courage. The final section of his statement cut through propaganda to reach uncomfortable truth. And courage without resources is just delayed defeat. We laughed at them in 1943. I personally mocked them, reported to headquarters they were meat for slaughter, called them Indianer and pregnant cows, and every dismissive name we could invent. His voice had dropped to barely audible levels. We're not laughing now. When you hear those guns, that terrible sound of 8 machine guns firing in perfect synchronization, you know death has come calling. The sound haunts us. Mechanical, precise, unstoppable, like everything American. Priller's conclusion violated every propaganda directive, but captured reality that frontline troops already understood. It's about overwhelming material superiority. They didn't beat us through better tactics or braver pilots. They buried us under an avalanche of steel and lead. An avalanche we could never stop, never slow, never survive. I have lost 60 pilots since D-Day, 60 men, each one irreplaceable. The Americans lost hundreds of aircraft in the same period, all replaced within days. This is not war between nations. This is war between an industry and an army. The industry won. The interview was never broadcast. The transcript was filed with notation that content was unsuitable for public morale purposes. But copies circulated among Luftwaffe commanders who recognized truth when they encountered it. April 1945 found the Luftwaffe existing largely on paper. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Experienced pilots were dead or captured, replaced by teenagers whose training consisted of weeks rather than years. Airfields were cratered ruins, bombed repeatedly by the same Thunderbolts that now ranged across Germany, destroying anything that moved in daylight. But even with aircraft and fuel, German pilots faced an impossible equation. Attacking meant confronting P-47 formations that owned every altitude from ground level to 40,000 feet. The Americans flew in overwhelming numbers, positioned at every altitude band, covering every approach vector, creating defensive networks that couldn't be penetrated without accepting catastrophic losses. Feldwebel Klaus Brettschneider represented the last generation of German fighter pilots, trained in 1945 with resources that were already exhausted. He flew exactly one combat mission before the war ended. His encounter with P-47s over Leipzig lasted 12 seconds, the time required for his world to transform from aerial combat to falling through sky in a parachute, watching his aircraft burn on the way down. His account, recorded in a captured diary discovered in the processing center where Wehrmacht prisoners were documented. I saw them diving from above, 4 Thunderbolts in perfect formation, textbook attack profile. I tried to turn, but they were too fast. Physics doesn't care about desperation. The leader fired from 500 meters. Brettschneider's handwriting became increasingly erratic as the entry continued. My aircraft shook like it was hit by sledgehammers. Not bullets, sledgehammers. The engine exploded, actually exploded, throwing pieces in every direction. The wings separated, just tore away from the fuselage. I barely escaped, had to kick the canopy off because the mechanism had jammed. Falling through sky, he'd watched them destroy his entire staffel. 6 fighters gone in under 1 minute. The sky rained burning aluminum and bodies. Men he'd trained with, shared barracks with, who'd talked about girls back home and plans for after the war that would never materialize. All gone because American industry had produced overwhelming force and delivered it with mechanical efficiency. His final observation carried weight that transcended tactical assessment. I received 30 hours training in Messerschmitt 109. The American who shot me down probably had 300 hours in his Thunderbolt. This is not war. This is execution. We send boys against men, obsolete aircraft against modern ones, hope against mathematics. The outcome was determined before we took off. The human cost of this industrial war was documented in statistics that captured suffering inadequately. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 28,000 pilots killed in combat against Western Allied forces between 1943 and 1945. Many fell to the concentrated fire of American heavy machine guns, 8 weapons working in synchronized harmony to transform aircraft and pilots into debris. Each loss represented years of training Germany could never replace, experience that died with the man, institutional knowledge that vanished permanently. By war's end, the average German fighter pilot had less than 30 hours of combat experience. The average P-47 pilot had over 200. The disparity wasn't accidental. American training establishments had been designed for total war, built to scale, resourced adequately, operated continuously. German training had been optimized for quick victories in limited wars, never anticipating the grinding attrition of multi-year conflict against opponents with superior industrial capacity. At the Luftwaffe Interrogation Center at Ober-Ursel, captured Allied pilots were debriefed by German intelligence officers seeking tactical insights that might provide advantages. The records captured in 1945 when Allied forces overran the facility revealed German assessments of Allied aircraft that had evolved dramatically over 2 years. The file on the P-47, updated continuously throughout the war, showed complete reversal of opinion, documented in stark language that admitted errors without excuse. April 1943. Large, unmaneuverable fighter. Inferior to German types in all performance parameters except dive speed. Machine gun armament insufficient against cannon-armed fighters. Assessment, minimal threat. December 1943. Exceptional high-altitude performance. Extreme structural strength. Firepower increasingly problematic. Pilots showing improved tactics. Assessment, significant threat above 25,000 feet. June 1944. Dominant fighter bomber, superior to all German types above 20,000 feet. Firepower devastating against all target types. Structural strength makes shoot-down extremely difficult. Assessment, critical threat at all altitudes. March 1945. Best fighter bomber of the war, combination of firepower, durability, and performance unmatched. Pilot quality exceptional. Assessment, unsurvivable in direct engagement. Recommend avoiding contact when possible. The final assessment, added in April 1945 by an intelligence officer whose name would be lost when Germany surrendered, contained brutal honesty about capabilities Germany could no longer contest. The P-47 represents American industrial philosophy applied to aerial warfare. Every component overbuilt, every system redundant, every weakness addressed through engineering rather than tactics. They didn't create a European fighter. They created an American one, designed around production, firepower, and survivability. Against sustained industrial output, tactical brilliance is insufficient. We learned this too late. The statistics of P-47 operations defied comprehension, even when documented in official reports. In Europe, 3,752 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 3,315 aircraft destroyed on ground, 86,000 railway cars destroyed, 9,000 locomotives destroyed, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles destroyed, 68,000 trucks destroyed, 60,000 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed. In the Pacific, 697 Japanese aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 150 aircraft destroyed on ground, 1,500 vehicles destroyed, 150 locomotives destroyed, countless barges, ships, and installations. The 9th Air Force alone, primarily equipped with P-47s, flew 213,873 combat sorties, dropped 120,000 tons of bombs, fired 135 million rounds of ammunition, and launched 60,000 rockets. Thunderbolt units achieved 4.6 to 1 kill ratio in aerial combat, while maintaining the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter bomber. But numbers on pages failed to capture what these statistics meant. Behind each destroyed locomotive was a supply chain disrupted, munitions that never reached front lines, troops that went hungry or lacked ammunition when battle arrived. Behind each destroyed truck was mobility denied, tactical flexibility eliminated, Wehrmacht forced into defensive positions where Allied artillery could systematically destroy them. Behind each aircraft destroyed on the ground was a pilot who survived temporarily, but would die later when forced to fly obsolete aircraft against overwhelming opposition. 1985. Phoenix, Arizona. A reunion of German and American fighter pilots brought former adversaries together 4 decades after the war ended. The men who tried to kill each other in skies over Europe now shared drinks and stories. Age and perspective having transformed enemies into something approaching friends who'd shared experiences few others could understand. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, former head of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, had agreed to attend despite initial reluctance. He'd spent 40 years processing Germany's defeat, understanding how tactical decisions had been overwhelmed by strategic realities, accepting that courage and skill had proven insufficient against industrial capacity applied systematically. An American interviewer, recording the reunion for historical archives, asked Galland about the P-47. The question was inevitable. The Thunderbolt had become legendary, its reputation established through combat record that exceeded any other American fighter in total sorties flown and ordnance delivered. Gallen's response, captured on video, would become one of the most honest assessments of aerial warfare's evolution during World War II. His voice carried accent but clarity, words chosen carefully. "We made a terrible mistake in 1943. We saw this big, heavy fighter and laughed. The Americans don't understand air combat," we said. "They built a bomber and called it a fighter. Look at how it climbs, how it turns. Our Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts will destroy them easily." Gallen paused, looking at the restored P-47 sitting on display at the reunion venue. "We were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans didn't try to build a European fighter. They built an American one, designed around production, firepower, and survivability. They understood that in a war of attrition, the plane that could take punishment and deliver devastating firepower would win. They were right. We were wrong, and it cost us the sky, and ultimately, the war." His assessment continued with details that only someone who'd experienced both sides could provide. "The first time I flew a captured P-47 after the war, this was in 1946, the Americans let me fly one at Wright Field. I understood everything. The power was incredible. It climbed like it was falling upward. The cockpit was comfortable, spacious, visibility excellent. The controls were precise, responsive. It was a pilot's aircraft wrapped in armor that could withstand punishment no European fighter could survive. But technical appreciation wasn't what impressed Gallen most. What really struck me was sitting in that cockpit and realizing America built over 15,000 of these complex machines while fighting a two-ocean war. Each one required an engine more complex than anything Germany produced. The R-2800 Double Wasp had 2,400 individual parts, each machined to tolerances we couldn't achieve in peacetime production, let alone under wartime conditions. His conclusion captured the fundamental asymmetry, yet they built them faster than we could build simple fighters. That's when I knew we never had a chance. The moment America entered the war with full industrial commitment, our defeat was inevitable. The P-47 was just the instrument that made it clear. Those guns. Gallen's voice trailed off momentarily, memory clearly still carrying weight. "We called them Roosevelt's piano because of the sound they made when firing all 8 together. Once you heard that sound, you never forgot it. It meant your aircraft was being torn apart, and you had perhaps 2 seconds to bail out if you were lucky enough to have controls still responding." He looked at the American veterans in attendance, former enemies who delivered that firepower. "Many of my friends heard that sound for the last time. Good pilots, brave men, Germany's best. Against the Thunderbolt, bravery wasn't enough. Skill wasn't enough. Experience wasn't enough. The P-47 didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it destroyed it systematically, methodically, with American efficiency that we couldn't match or counter or survive." A long pause followed, Gallen studying the restored aircraft with expression mixing respect and residual fear. "You know what the worst part was? We knew. By late 1944, every pilot knew. When you heard that thunder, that distinctive roar of the paddle blade propeller, you knew they were coming, and you knew that someone was about to die. Usually it was us." At the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47D sits among legendary fighters from World War II. The placard lists specifications and battle honors. 15,683 produced, 3,752 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 4.6 to 1 kill ratio. But the real story is told by a small display case containing spent .50 caliber shells and a strip of gun camera film showing a Focke-Wulf 190 disintegrating under fire. Below the display is a quote from an unnamed German pilot taken from a 1945 interrogation report. Words that captured the transformation from mockery to terror. "We laughed when we first saw them. Fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight by any conventional definition. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to turn or climb. They just pointed those guns at you, and you ceased to exist." The laughter died with our comrades. The P-47 Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced. Its empty weight of 10,000 pounds exceeded the gross weight of some twin-engine fighters. Its engine produced more power than entire bomber formations from the previous war. Its weapons delivered more firepower than a squad of infantry. Yet it was built by the thousands, flown by kids barely out of high school, maintained under combat conditions by mechanics who learned their trade in weeks. The transformation from object of derision to instrument of annihilation took less than 2 years. In that time, the flying milk bottles became the most feared aircraft in Luftwaffe experience. Veterans who had faced Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Soviet Yaks without flinching spoke of P-47s in hushed tones decades after the war ended. The distinctive thunder of approaching Thunderbolts caused reactions that transcended tactical assessment, touching something primal about confronting force that couldn't be overcome through skill or courage or desperation. The sky had belonged to Germany in 1940, to Britain in 1941, contested by both in 1942. By 1943, control began shifting. By 1944, the shift was complete. The Thunderbolts had spoken. Their 8 synchronized Browning machine guns had rewritten the rules of aerial warfare and buried the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of lead that no amount of tactical brilliance could survive. German pilots had laughed at the ungainly American fighter in April 1943. By May 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh. The thunder had spoken, and the world had listened.